Hi guys, welcome to the final session of this Easy Still Life painting series. So we've just been painting, I've been painting this lemon, and you guys can either work alongside using the reference link provided in the description of the video, or you can use your own fruit. So any kind of like single fruit still life basically is what we're working on in a nice kind of simple setup. This is going to be the final session of the series. So we're pretty much going to consolidate everything. We got all the texture down in the previous session, but everything it isn't entirely kind of refined, so there's some stuff we need to do in terms of sort of developing these smaller textural forms today. Not too much work really, just a kind of final pulling together of everything. And then we're also going to have a little bit of a look at edging and giving a sense that the sort of lemon sits, say, in front of the background, or the sort of softened edges around the shadow and that sort of thing. So just those sorts of final details really is what we're going for. So I don't have the reference up in the video, but I've kind of zoomed in a little bit so you guys can see a bit closer what I'm doing. But you've got access to the reference, so if you want to get it up and have a look at it, you can do so while I'm working. So the first thing I'm going to do, like the last few weeks, is just make sure everything's oiled in. So just take a tiny little bit of medium from my palette cup. Can use the same medium as last week, and just wash that over the darker tones. And to be honest, it seems like it doesn't need too much of an oil in this one. It's not altered enormously since doing that, so that's good. So that's pretty much oiled in. It's all saturated, so we can carry on working. So my main sort of concerns this week are figuring out the edges, the sort of neatening the edges around the lemon, which means I can start just using a couple of my smaller brushes like we've been using. Take a little bit of ivory black, touch of white. I'm going to mix up that background grey that we've been using, which, if you remember, is just ivory black and white to keep it nice and simple. So everything about this series is just trying to make it as manageable as possible as a sort of introduction to still life painting. So you can just go through, make sure these edges are nice and sharp and the right shape, describing the right stuff. Yeah, that's not too bad. It's only like a tiny bit of neatening. The other thing I can do in terms of edging is if I just pull a little bit of a line, mix up some medium with that darker background color, a little bit of a lower line just along the sort of horizon edge, or the tabletop edge where it meets the lighter part of the tabletop. So I can paint in an edge. It's the same color as the rest of it. And I'm going to paint a slightly lighter, or mix up a slightly lighter color for the background, and just paint them next to each other. So I've matched both background colors, and then I'm just painting them up against each other. And then this brush that I was using for oiling in, I can just sort of wipe off a little bit, and then just run that along between those 2 points, and it'll just blend them together, so it creates a sort of smudgier background line. And that makes you can see that starts to make the lemon pop forward even more, which is what we're after. So those sorts of little shifts in the sort of relationship between the edges. So we're talking about the edge of the lemon, where that meets the background. That's sharper now, feels sharper now than the background behind. Up here I can just kind of smudge a little bit as well. And you can do that through any section. So for instance, if I mix up a little bit of the lemon color, here this kind of darker halftone of the lemon color. If I mix that up right up to this edge here, but then I just smudge that into the background, but keep this little section here that's jutting out sharper, it's going to make it seem like the bit that's sharper and jutting out is further forward, which it is. It's sort of like, it's a slight kind of photographic technique that we're using here. So this is what happens, we know this is what happens with photographs when we have depth of field. So we're just kind of playing around with that in our painting. So it's not something you necessarily see a lot in older paintings, but since sort of the advent of photography, people's awareness of kind of more of a sense of focus and focal point, something we can kind of play up a bit more. So I'm just blending back and forth between these, the grey and the background colour. Had a little bit too much paint on my brush there, so I'm just trying to clean my brush off, because otherwise I'm adding too much and I want to not really add, I just want to smudge. So I'm trying to smudge these two colours in together like that. Yeah, and that's working a lot better. I could do the same thing up at this edge. So again, kind of create a little bit more of a yellow border there to blend into, then get some of my darker grey background colour. Make sure that's around it, maybe a little bit darker than that even. Just pop that behind it, and then just let them smudge into each other. And so then that becomes a softer edge than the forward portion of the lemon. So you're always just thinking about what's closer to the viewer, and whatever's closer to the viewer is what we want to make sharper. And as things go back, they get softer. So we focus this in more so on the overlap, so not necessarily everywhere in the painting, but certainly where two forms are sort of overlapping each other, like this. We want to make sure that you've got that sense of sort of sharpness and softness working. There we go. So still sticking with these darker tones, because I've got them on my brush, I also just want to kind of soften and round off this bottom edge slightly more. So I can take a bit of black, a bit of burnt umber, and I'm just going to sort of partially glaze just this portion of the lemon that drops down, bends around, and meets the shadow. So I did this a little bit last week, but I just want to play it up a little bit more. So using a fair bit of medium, fairly thinly painted on, so it's more of a glaze that we're using, so dark colour painted over a light colour. I just want to get the base of this lemon blending up into the core of the shadow. just trying to turn that shadow a little bit more, and that's working pretty well. So I can just use a little bit more medium, spread it a little bit more thinly, the glaze. It's also adding a little bit more texture, which is quite nice. Beyond the whole, that's looking pretty good. Just a little bit more at this edge as well. Slightly darker tone there. So it creates this sense that we've got this proper glow in the center of the lemon there, which is quite nice. And then the final thing that we need to do, I'm pretty happy with all the shadows below. I just want to go in and refine some of these little, I guess the shadows we'd call them within the texture. So we kind of just plonked on all the light tones last time, but we didn't really refine how the light tones sort of interact with the shadow edge. So I'm going to go a little bit more specific, add some more detail. So I'm going to make it more as though it's sort of turning out of that shadow edge, rather than just being kind of light colors patched on. So I'm starting just by working along the edge. All the way along until we've got this kind of darker shadow edge, just slightly reaffirmed after last session. And we're sort of slightly pulling up some of the shadow tones into the textured halftones, darker halftones from last session. It's pretty much just a glaze, like I'm just using thin burnt umber. Sort of reintroducing a little bit of warmth into some of those cooler, kind of greenier halftones that we had there before, which I think works quite well. It's a funny mixture of sort of cool tones and warm tones of lemon. And so this sort of layered glazing method has actually worked quite well to balance between those two. So you can see I'm just really lightly kind of dry brush glazing over, just to sort of turn those forms a little bit more, make them a little bit more complex. And I can mix up a slightly sort of cooler, a little bit too cool, darker lemon halftone color as well, similar to what was already there. And I can blend that back down into the shadows a little bit too. Just to kind of turn back into them a bit. So again, it's really just working this shadow edge is all we're worried about, and it's getting there. It's not looking too bad, that edge. I think I'll probably roughly leave it like that. Maybe just a touch more, a few little darker bits kind of creeping their way up a little bit higher. Maybe not quite that dark. Mix some of my green colour into the burnt umber. That's maybe a little bit too light. Sorry, too dark, so I'm going to lighten that off slightly up there. Start working my way up a little bit more towards the lighter tones. So mixing up some slightly lighter darker colours, if that makes any sense. Still sort of glazing, kind of scrubbing my way over. Just trying to refine this texture a bit, which is really one of our main sort of goals of this session. Can mix up some slightly darker yellows just to kind of work back slightly into the highlight and sort of start to kind of give some context to the kind of more glittery highlight, how it falls down into the lower tones here. I'm breaking the colour slightly as well, so we're starting to get kind of a mixture of those warmer yellows, as I say, and the lighter yellows. I'm just going to clean off one of my brushes, and I want to get some white. I want to relay a little bit of white just to blend into some of those darker yellows that I just placed. The highlight sort of rolling down into those lightest halftones rather than being too sharp on top. Just going to go in with the white. I just want to ease off slightly some of these darker yellows. They stand out just a little bit too much because we want to think about the whole sort of context of the lemon form. So the lightest bits, even though there are going to be some little dark notches, they're not going to be overly dark. We kind of want to make sure there's this kind of general sense of the form turning down towards the darker tones, the shadows and so on. yeah, that seems pretty good. So I think that's it for this little study. Obviously, you can always keep pushing stuff forward, but I'm reasonably happy with it in terms of capturing the quality of this lemon, getting the form, getting the texture, and so on. So yeah, have a crack at either this reference yourself, the same reference you can download, or better yet, set up your own little still life, work from life ideally, and follow the same process. So you're starting with a wash drawing, moving into colour, developing form, developing texture, and then kind of refining it. And yeah, it keeps it simple, keeps it manageable, so it's a nice easy process to follow when you're trying to learn to oil paint. Yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy it. As always, subscribe to the channel. We're always making new courses and all sorts of new content that's really interesting for budding artists. And you can also click the link through to sign up to the school and get even more access, or access to even more features and tutors. So yeah, that's it, and I'll see you guys on the next course.